We're facing, they say, the most consequential election of our lifetime.
Elections have consequences. And those that we put in power pass the laws and make decisions that affect our country.
2020 is very important, and we can't sit this one out.
It's almost a cliche to say this could be the most important election of our lifetime, but surely a lot is at stake in the 2020 vote.
The left is trying to take over the country and impose a socialist state on America. If they win this time around, I'm not sure we'll ever get the American freedom we're used to back.
Election 2020 is unbelievably important. Look, election 2016 was important. If that election had gone a different direction, 2 Supreme Court vacancies would have been filled by a very liberal president, and everything from the sanctity of life to religious liberty would be deeply in jeopardy. But in 2020, the country's still on that razor's edge. The courts are getting better, but they're nowhere close to being the kind of courts that the American people and that men and women of faith could rely on to effectively defend the Constitution as the Founding Fathers wrote it. So on the sanctity of life, religious liberty, many other issues, the next president will determine the direction of the country for our children and grandchildren, probably for the next 30 or 40 years.
One thing is to allow millions of illegal immigrants into the country, not keep track of them, and then weaken the voting laws. And in the book, I go through a number of ways they do this. They fight voter ID laws, and everybody agrees on them. Every demographic polled says they support voter ID. And yet, all over the country, voter ID laws are under attack. Former President Obama and former Attorney General Eric Holder are still attacking those laws as racist, as bigoted, as suppressing the minority vote. And they do this without any evidence.
They've put things on the table like packing the court with additional justices, getting rid of the Electoral College so that it's just a popular vote, which means that a few large, highly populated states would end up running the country and deciding what the values are of the great American heartland. That anybody that had our type of values, pro-life, pro-family, believing in reliable standards of right and wrong, believing that this was a country built on ordered liberty under God, that no one that believed those things would ever be able to get elected as President of the United States again.
Bob Knight points out in his book that a practice out of California called ballot harvesting is becoming a tool by which some are committing voter fraud.
Ballot harvesting is one of the latest techniques that the left is using to, I believe, steal elections. Ballot harvesting is legal in some jurisdictions, and it means you can go out and collect ballots from people you're not related to. Usually you cannot turn in a ballot for someone you're not related to, and that's to prevent vote fraud. In California, after they initiated ballot harvesting, the elections changed considerably. In Orange County, California, that was a bastion of conservative politics. Republicans were elected there very easily for decades. In the last election, several Republicans were leading on election night, one of them by 14%. And then thousands of ballots came in that were harvested by volunteers, usually union leaders, and that swept the Democrats to power in all congressional districts in Orange County. Now, I can't believe that Orange County overnight became a Democratic county, other than the ballot harvesting that facilitated it.
In the state of California, the law has recently changed so that instead of allowing people to merely go to the polls or vote by absentee mail, they've changed it so that third parties, either political operations or just grassroots activists, can go house to house and collect absentee ballots to take to the polls. Now, the concern of this is that you end up having labor unions or far-left activist organizations that show up at low-propensity voters who have received a vote-by-mail ballot. In some counties, actually, they're changing it so that all voting is done by mail, and they can go to those people that might not normally decide to go to the polls and vote, but they can essentially not tell them how to vote, but encourage them potentially about what they might want to do in a certain situation or in a certain race.
Another attempt to steal votes is by not getting the voter registration rolls up to date. There's an old joke that goes like this: how does a lifelong conservative from Chicago become a liberal voter all of a sudden? By dying. Critics note voter ID laws are a common sense safeguard against voter fraud.
The question I always ask is, how can you be against accurate voter rolls and say that's somehow racist or suppressing the vote when everybody's treated the same? How can you say that voter ID, where everybody is subject to the same rules and has to prove who they say they are and who is registered, how can that be racist or suppressing the vote? Frankly, it isn't. It doesn't suppress the vote. Minorities support it. The Democratic legislature in Rhode Island in 2011, heavily dominated by Democrats, they have a strong minority presence, and one of the leading black legislators sponsored a bill to create voter ID in Rhode Island. How can you call that racist? He was asked about it. He said, well, why are you doing this? And he said, well, because my people aren't voting often enough because they don't think their vote's going to count. They think there's so much vote fraud because we don't have voter ID that why bother voting? So he wanted accurate voting rolls.
Ken Blackwell of the Family Research Council once served as the Ohio Secretary of State, a responsibility which includes certifying election results.
If it was difficult to get a voter ID, you can say it was a restraint to participation. Well, it's not difficult. And you just think, whether it's taking out a library book, getting on an airplane, buying certain, adult beverages, you have to show an ID. I challenge anybody who basically says that it is difficult or not common practice to have an ID. And so what better place to use, an ID than, for voting, so that, all you're showing is that you are who you claim to be, and you're protecting everybody from having their legally cast ballots from being neutralized by an illegally cast ballot.
I would encourage you not to consider sitting out election 2020. Sometimes people misconstrue the personality traits that are deficient in some instances, that are good in some instances, as being a determining factor as whether or not they should engage. I think none of those things should determine whether or not Christians should participate civically. Our mandate to engage the society around us comes from the scripture.
It is ironic that our people, our children, are marching in the streets demanding socialism and watching what's happening in China right now, where their people are marching in the streets waving the American flags and demanding that China be like the United States of America. But this is a problem because in the last election, over 40 members of Congress ran as socialists. People don't realize that. So it has become fashionable right now because it had become fashionable on college campuses to be a socialist.
I think in California, the depressing thing that we see is that the state and a lot of the cities are 10 to 15 years farther down the road than the country as a whole. And I can guarantee you, if most of the rest of the country saw what we see on a regular basis, both in Sacramento and in some of these individual cities, they would not want to vote for leftist, progressive individuals. It's really deeply troubling that the news media, frankly, does not do a better job of covering the failures of a lot of these elected politicians and a lot of the administrative bureaucracies and the ways that they really are harming families, harming individuals. And I really hope that people around the country are able to see and learn from our example and not follow the same path.
So in my view, gospel proclamation and citizen engagement are together married. The wedding between the two of those concepts enable us to continue to be a shining light, a beacon on a hill, a city that propounds the gospel instead of retracting and retreating from that engagement in our time.